Well, it looks like the Canadian tariffs are postponed, probably indefinitely, and it has Americans and Canadians alike scratching our heads and asking, what just happened? According to Trump, the United States has vast natural resources and doesn't need Canadian lumber. And to be honest, he's correct. The United States doesn't need Canadian lumber. Now, before my Canadian viewers come after me in the comments and assert I have no idea what I'm talking about, hear me out. The United States has more spare lumber production capacity than it ever has had in its entire history. But this production is largely unusable, and it's not unusable because of cheap Canadian lumber flooding the market, but because our own laws have banned this production by making the boards effectively illegal. I'm speaking, of course, about the lumber produced by small sawmills owned and operated by the everyday American landowner. Last summer, I actually purchased a small portable sawmill from Woodland Mills, which, by the way, is a Canadian company, and honestly, I was blown away. These things are absolutely amazing, and it inspired me to make an entire video really highlighting how miraculous it is from a historical standpoint that so much production can now be put in the hands of the everyday landowner. But as some of you rightly pointed out in the comments, my thesis around these mills was flawed. Due to building codes requiring lumber to be stamped and graded prior to use in construction, the boards from these mills are effectively illegal. Now, while laws vary and some localities do allow you to use these boards for personal use if you appeal to the Crown for permission, generally speaking, if you wish to sell them for these purposes, you're going to have to either pay to have them graded or become a licensed grader yourself, which, as many of you who run small sawmills told me in the comments, that's a process so expensive and burdensome, especially for those who just want to do it on the side as a little side gig, that by the time you do it, it really isn't worth it. So if the goal is to build American industry and utilize existing capacity to supply America with much needed lumber, my question is, why are we still doing this bullshit? Why are we focusing on trade policies that are going to harm people instead of solving the issue by increasing the economic freedom of everyone? Now, certainly some of you are going to be saying, we can't do that. Those laws are there for our safety. They're there to safeguard the structural integrity of our buildings. And to that I say, I will believe you when I stop finding 2x4s in Home Depot that break in half when you try to pound a nail through them. Over the past several decades, milling technology and efficiency has improved to such a degree that we now utilize many more younger trees and tops of trees that simply don't have the same quality as lower and larger stems. And so arguably, the quality of the supply of our lumber has declined, notwithstanding these rules. If the regulations were stringent to such a degree that prevented substantial timber volumes from being utilized, the industry would just lobby to reduce these regulations. And that happens. Back in 2016, as a response to planted Norway spruce supplies coming online in Maine, the Northeastern Lumber Manufacturers Association worked with the University of Maine in order to approve Norway spruce's use in residential construction so that supply would actually have a market. Big players have the resources to get these rules changed, and they are changed when they interfere with business, just not your business. And so fundamentally, these regulations aren't about safety. They are, however, about protection, protectionism. They create an artificial barrier to entry to small firms, and thus an artificial economy of scale where none would exist otherwise. And if you're still skeptical, I'm just going to show you this picture. Above is a stamped and graded 2x4 from Lowe's. Below is an unstamped and ungraded 2x4 from a local small-scale sawmill. Look me in the eye and tell me the stamped 2x4 is safer. Now, if you're wondering why the stamped 2x4 is smaller, the historical explanation is that wood shrinks a little bit when it dries and material is removed during the planing process. But that's not really true anymore. They're cut below the nominal specifications from the very beginning. And if they really wanted to, they could mill them in such a way that the end product matched those nominal specifications. So at the end of the day, it's a more or less arbitrary standard. Now, I'm not demonizing big box lumber here. It's certainly the case from a structural standpoint that thicker lumber is not necessary. But the question's about the regulations. Do they make sense? Is it fair that lumber that's 40% thicker is restricted under the guise of safety? Now, right now, I'm just talking about lumber, but there's a much bigger point to all this that I think we really need to understand. So stick with me here. So right now, I'm actually in Malaysia. I've lived in Mexico, I've spent time in the Philippines. I generally really enjoy being in developing economies. And that's because when a society is faced with scarcity, it sparks an ingenuity and resiliency that you just don't see in the United States. It really brings you back to basics and makes you realize that at its core, an economy is just a system for the allocation of scarce resources. The more scarcity there is, generally, the more practical that allocation. That's a reality that's just not captured by GDP figures, even the better ones I prefer, like purchase power parity. A lot of poorer countries, while they are poorer, they have standards of living far above what you would expect because their allocation of their GDP is a lot more efficient, or at the very least, it's more value-oriented. So just as an example, let's talk about restaurants for a second. So let's look at Olive Garden. Olive Garden is what I would call an everyday luxury restaurant. It sits on prime real estate in the center of town, and you go in and it has nice tables, nice chairs and decor, and then you get your food, and it consists of canned Alfredo sauce, boxed noodles, and frozen shrimp. And honestly, that might be generous. And of course, the entire meal might cost you $150 to feed your family, maybe $200. I don't go to Olive Garden. In a developing country, a typical restaurant experience might look like this. You walk into what is essentially somebody's garage, you sit down on a plastic lawn chair, and you eat a delicious home-cooked meal with sauces made from scratch, all cooked over an open mesquite flame. And it's all served to you on a faded Dragon Ball Z plate. The whole thing is going to cost you a lot less than Olive Garden or even McDonald's, even when you look at it as a percent of local incomes, depending on the country, of course. That's because all the resources were put into the thing that mattered the most, the thing that put the most value in your life, the food. So when you go to Olive Garden, the microwaved pasta is only a portion of your bill. You're paying for the real estate, you're paying for the decor, the employee uniforms, the HR departments, and so on. Now those do add something, I'm not saying they don't, but the value is poor. Now some of this is cultural, granted, but in the United States, could you realistically start a restaurant from your garage? No, absolutely not. You have to get a license, then there are health codes, fire codes, and that's to say nothing of zoning restrictions. The starting costs are so high that it necessitates more traffic than what would otherwise be viable, which means you need better real estate, which means higher starting costs. Regulations create a minimum viable size for a firm, which necessitate a certain amount of resource allocation and efficiency. On paper, our GDP is high, but our standards of living are nowhere near where they should be because so much of that production is locked in things that just don't add much value to our lives, like the tablecloths at Olive Garden, or the stamp on every little piece of lumber. And the restaurant example follows through to virtually every other industry, including housing. It's a big reason why affordable housing simply doesn't exist. Regulations add an estimated $93,000 to the cost of every new home, and that's to say nothing of the second-order effects of supply restriction. Part of that $93,000 is the stamp on every piece of lumber. Whenever we restrict competition, we pay for it one way or another. We can't afford this anymore. We have to come to terms with the fact that the United States is no longer a rich country. We're a middle-class country that is one unexpected bill away from foreclosure. When we're growing in prosperity and standards of living, we can hide the true effects of these stupid regulations. But when we're in a state of what I would call de-development, we can't hide from them. The more we try to hide from them, the more our standards of living will fall. Now, I just want to be clear about something. I've spent time in neighborhoods where, forget about stamped lumber, the primary construction materials were corrugated sheet metal, old advertising banners, and bottle cap rivets. I have seen both sides of this, and yes, some codes are good, particularly the ones pertaining to wastewater management. But I'd guess we could get rid of 80% of them and see nothing but good results. And I know I'm more radical on that than most. I'm not asking for you to agree with me. Right now, I just want to be able to build using whatever lumber I want. Leave the Canadians out of it. My beef is with my own government. Now, in terms of practical policy, I think the most palatable way to write this would be to only require grading if you're cutting lumber below nominal specifications. I think it's fair and reasonable that if you're cutting lumber thinner, you should be beholden to additional safety regulations. So, write your local lawmaker, bully them, slander them, whatever your preferred method of political action. I don't have much faith in the political system, but these laws can be changed on the local level. So there is hope. There's a lot of momentum right now around ending things like prohibitions on selling raw milk. That's great. I think raw milk is gross, but I agree in principle. I just wish there was more momentum around ending the regulations that more directly affect the biggest issues we face today, like the cost of living crisis. So I'll leave you with that. As always, if you want to learn more about forest management so you can break the lumber cartels and their infernal regulatory framework, you can grab my book, How to Read Your Forest, which will give you an overview of all things forest management, which you can pick up for free using the link in the description and the comments below. And if you want to take your forest management to the next level, join Silvicultural, my forestry community that combines social media with forestry software and tools to give you everything you need to grow a forest, including mapping and GPS tools, forest growth estimation, sustainable harvest planning, financial analysis, and courses. And if you join now, you can get a lifetime membership to give you lifetime access to all of these features and future developments. So go ahead and check that out. And I will catch you guys later.